Coming up on Cannabis Coast to Coast News this week, as Trump's approval rating shrinks, federal rumblings from congressional researchers support congressional lawmakers' right to reform cannabis laws faster than the D.C. government bureaucracy. We talked with NORML's Morgan Fox in D.C.
One of the messages that I've been trying to get across to lawmakers is that this is a wildly popular issue nationwide. It's very, very difficult to find something that Americans agree on more than legalizing cannabis.
That's Josh Kesselman being interviewed at MJ BizCon last year by our news team's own Amy Carter from Michigan. Kesselman is the CEO of Raw Papers, and he bought High Times out of receivership this week for $3.6 million. We'll talk with the former editor of High Times, the celeb stoner himself, Steve Bloom.
He's been in the business for a long time. He's sort of a true believer. I think that's what you need to be when you work at High Times.
Plus, the decision to crush the hemp industry in Texas is in as Texas Governor Greg Abbott makes his decision on the hemp ban bill on his desk on Sunday, while on Saturday he signed the expansion of that state's medical marijuana program. And Minnesota issues its first grow license in that new adult use state. All that and Coast to Coast and international cannabis news reports on Cannabis Coast to Coast News next. Happy summer, everybody, especially to our faithful pro-cannabis media supporters. I'm Jimmy Young, the executive producer of this weekly news show, Cannabis Coast to Coast News, and we've got some big news happening over the summer, so please continue to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter yet, please do so on our website. That's procannabismedia.com. Karen Black does a great job on the design, and we release it every month. Now, this is when we share the QR code on the screen, so you can go to the Google Play or the App Store and download the free PCM Space TV app. Just remember to put that space between the PCM and the TV. Okay, it's the end of June, and this is the time of year when everything shuts down for 2 weeks so people can enjoy the beginning of summer. Now, that includes our own Elena Pinto, who will be back when we are back on Monday, July 14th, with a new show. In the meantime, I've enlisted some members of the Cannabis Coast to Coast news team to help me out this week, and you know I am Jimmy Young in Massachusetts.
I'm Karen Black in Arizona.
Hey, I'm Mark Allen, the Chicago clone guy.
I'm Kimmy Cannabis in Oklahoma.
I'm Amy Carter from Michigan.
I'm Marianne from Alibi with the Oregon Cannabis Report.
Brandon Jones with Bee Green Distribution of Missouri Cannabis Report.
Our top story this week focuses on our nation's capital. It's been very quiet on Pennsylvania Avenue, at least as far as cannabis reform is concerned. President Trump hasn't referenced his campaign promise of reform yet, but his approval ratings are falling, and that alone could trigger him to make a call to House Speaker Mike Johnson and direct him to get the States Act 2.0 passed, or at least reschedule cannabis off Schedule 1. This would bypass the tactics of the DEA to delay the process that was moving along before the election in November last year. With more on the federal reform front, here's Andrew Behringer.
I'm Andrew Behringer with the Washington, D.C. Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. A new development in the long-stalled effort to reschedule cannabis at the federal level. Congressional researchers are now suggesting there may be a faster path forward than the current administrative process that's been dragging on for so many years. The Congressional Research Service released a report last week arguing that Congress could simply bypass the current rescheduling process entirely and enact cannabis reform through direct legislation. This would offer what researchers call greater speed and flexibility while avoiding the legal challenges that have plagued the administrative approach so far. Here is where things stand. The Biden administration started this process years ago, attempting to move cannabis from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. After an 11-month review by Health and Human Services, the DEA completed its own assessment and the Justice Department formally proposed the change. but then the process stalled. Administrative hearings have been on hold with no future action scheduled, and the Trump administration has now inherited this unfinished business. Enter Terrence Cole, whose confirmation as DEA administrator recently advanced through a Senate committee. Cole has called examining the rescheduling proposal one of my first priorities, saying it's time to move forward on this stalled process. However, surprise, surprise, he hasn't committed to any specific outcome and has previously voiced concerns about cannabis's dangers, including linking cannabis use to higher suicide risk among youth. Congressional action compared to administrative could happen immediately and would face much more limited court challenges. The report suggested this isn't just about speed, it's about creating a better regulatory framework. The current Controlled Substances Act may be inadequate for comprehensive cannabis regulation, especially given the disconnect between federal prohibition and state legalization programs operating in dozens of states. Now, with no timeline for the current proceedings and a new administration taking charge, the path forward for federal cannabis policy remains uncertain. Well, that's the Washington, D.C. report. I'm Andrew Behringer, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
The regulatory divide in hemp and the cannabis industry is impacting lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. and state governments all over the country. Ever since the Farm Bill was passed in 2018, the federal definition of hemp was set at 0.3%. That industry has grown into its own under-regulated billion-dollar industry. The over-regulated licensed cannabis community and businesses have never been happy with sharing the new market with this product. Both are made from the same plant, and when people figured it out, you can get high from hemp, that industry exploded. Texas alone has 8,000 hemp dispensaries that could be shut down by the time you watch this week's news. Now that Delta 8 product may not be as potent as its Delta 9 cousin in licensed dispensaries, but states like Texas and California are moving to totally ban these hemp-derived products. Executive producer Jimmy Young talked with NORML's political director in Washington, D.C., Morgan Fox.
Thanks, Amy. Once again, we're able to reconnect with one of our friends in Washington, D.C. He is the political director of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. His name is Morgan Fox, and every time I see him quoted in an article, I tend to reach out to him so I can have an opportunity to hear it straight from Morgan's mouth. Morgan, always good to talk with you.
Hey, Jimmy, how are you?
Good enough. So I'm reading this week about the approval ratings of President Trump seem to be taking a bit of a hit here lately. And I've always been saying it will be his ego that perhaps drives any kind of action on his part to pick up the phone and perhaps put a little pressure on his Republican cronies in the Congress and what have you. Is the approval rating might help the movement towards what President Trump said on the campaign trail, which is he does want to move forward with rescheduling and some kind of federal reform? Is this a good thing?
Well, the entire issue is a little bit muddy. Unfortunately, cannabis policy reform is consistently buffeted by issues that have nothing to do with cannabis for both political and policy reasons. That being said, one of the messages that I've been trying to get across to lawmakers is that this is a wildly popular issue nationwide. It's very, very difficult to find something that Americans agree on more than legalizing cannabis. And so there is really no downside to embracing this as an issue. But again, it continues to be a relatively low priority issue with most lawmakers and even among voters themselves, although that is steadily starting to change. Hopefully lawmakers and the administration will start to catch up on this. But I do think that there are some opportunities to elevate the issue of cannabis policy reform at times when either the administration or individual members of Congress are taking heat on other issues because it is so popular and it's a very easy win basically across the board. How much that will actually play into actual policy being made, I think is something that we're going to have to wait and see on, but it's also a good indicator that we need to keep up the pressure.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the word bipartisan, which is rare in Washington, D.C. these days because the finger pointing continues from one side of the aisle to the other. That being said, the States Act was a bipartisan effort by Dave Joyce and Dina Titus. It is at least it has gone into committees. What are the chances, and what do you hear about others perhaps jumping on board and joining this bipartisan effort to make federal reform?
Well, we just saw Florida Republican Greg Steube sign on as a co-sponsor. I think that's a really good sign that we can expect additional co-sponsors in the coming weeks and months. Whether or not States 2.0 has the legs to move before the midterms, I think is a real big question, probably largely determined by budget negotiations being accomplished within a set timeline. And again, with other issues not related to cannabis sometimes taking up quite a bit of time on Capitol Hill, I think it's really an open question whether or not there will be time or appetite to really start addressing cannabis policy reform in terms of standalone legislation before the midterms. But it's certainly possible. And I think that, seeing additional Republican co-sponsorships on a bill that ostensibly creates a carve out for descheduling for individual states that have legalized cannabis for medical or adult use is a really, really good sign. We're also looking at other incremental legislation, and we have appropriations going on right now that offer some opportunities for us to get some incremental cannabis policy reform across the finish line before the midterms as well.
The rest of that interview with Morgan Fox will be published on Thursday of this week. One of the oldest brands in the cannabis industry is the magazine High Times. Started in the 1970s, it carved out quite a niche during the war on drugs in the decades that followed. Mismanagement landed High Times in receivership 18 months ago, and this past week, they were bought out of financial jail by the CEO of Raw Papers, Josh Kesselman. One of the biggest personalities and advocates in the industry, Kesselman came up with an all-cash buy of $3.6 million and was joined by a former officer of the company, Matt Stang. High Times will be bringing back its popular Cannabis Cup competitions in different states. Plus, they'll be relaunching the print magazine with limited-run collectible editions. They'll also be revamping their digital footprint with a network of cannabis podcasts, talk shows with experts and community advocates. Maybe they'd be interested in a news show. In the meantime, let's get the latest on the hemp industry with Kerry Hinkle.
Hi everyone, this is Kerry Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp, and I am back again for another hemp report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This week we head to the Tar Heel state, where pending legislation is looking to grapple with all things hemp yet again. Although this time the bill is under fire for both political and legislative reasons. So first off, the bill's text itself purports to regulate hemp and specifically Delta-9 products, but has been poorly written in a way that would actually ban some non-intoxicating products like CBD. So it is a little confounding that they would want to legalize Delta-9, but not CBD, CBG, or other cannabinoids that are inherently non-intoxicating. And part of that is probably due to the politics of it all, in that the Senate has quickly passed this bill. It went through committee and is now back to the House within a matter of hours. And reports on the ground are that Senate members that voted on the bill didn't really even know what they were voting on. And to make matters worse, or maybe more complicated, the chairman of the powerful House Rules Committee is a congressman named John Bell, and he actually has ownership stake in a hemp company. So while there is one member in Congress who is looking to defeat this bill and or amend it to be more favorable, perhaps maybe even for his own business interests, there are many other members, both in Senate and House leadership, that are looking to grapple with, products that don't have age gating, testing requirements, or other much needed regulations. And in the background of all this happening, too, the governor recently announced a task force that would tackle and grapple with this problem of marijuana, hemp products, and the commission would have law enforcement and legislators and business owners, and this was going to be a more comprehensive approach to tackle this complicated subject, which In my mind, seems like a reasonable approach, yet Senate leadership has quickly rushed through a bill that I don't think they understand what they're voting on. So next steps are that we see next week as a potential for the House to take up this quickly rushed through Senate bill. And of course, as in most states, they still have a pending budget to work through. So if the bill does not pass next week, then we expect summer session and debate to continue, and maybe that would provide more time for the governor's task force to examine all of these issues. But if not, then we could see a quickly haste through bill in North Carolina that would ban some products that I don't think they mean to ban, and would also implement some strict 3-tier language and problems around shipping products, etc. So that is my report this week for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Again, I'm Kerry Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp.
Hundreds of groups of cannabis advocates and health officials are putting pressure on the social media evil axis of Instagram, Facebook, and Meta to change their community guidelines towards the plant medicine. The groups have written an open letter to those social media companies to stop the practice that uses their guidelines as censorship tools. Hundreds of pages have been shadow banned or taken down with no warning or explanation that were created by legal cannabis businesses. Any positive information about the use of that plant are deemed controversial, including health information and educational posts. Of course, those sites have no problems sharing information from Big Pharma and the substance abuse community, but have been practicing unfair censorship over the past 6 years. Guess who had no comment? That's right, Instagram and Facebook Meta. In the District of Columbia over the past month and a half, the Alcohol, Beverage, and Cannabis Commission and the Metropolitan Police combined forces to close more than 5 illegal operations in the district. An amendment in July of 2024 gave the ABCA expanded civil enforcement powers, and more raids of illegal operations are continuing every week. One of those legal licensed operators in the district is Louis Joe.
I'm Louis Joe with Green Guard, the first social equity here in Washington, D.C., and the first and only carrier in the city. I know firsthand what it means to be a victim of the war on cannabis, and now we're hearing with all the racket going on in politics how the feds are coming into our backyard to yet again stipulate on what we can and cannot do. So here's the thing. D.C. isn't a state. That means it doesn't get the same autonomy or protections that states do when it comes to cannabis policy. When the Cole memo was in place, states with legal cannabis markets had a kind of federal green light to operate without interference, as long as they follow certain guidelines. But DC, it was always in a gray zone. So when Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole memo, that ambiguity got worse. Now, Ed Martin, currently acting or former acting U.S. Attorney for D.C., has reportedly expressed interest in rolling back what little protection D.C. has already. He's been accused of wanting to treat the district more like a federal jurisdiction than a self-governing entity. That's a big deal, DC, especially for medical cannabis licensees like you and like me, because it could mean increased scrutiny or even prosecution, despite local laws allowing us to work. This ties directly into what Morgan Fox, political director at NORML, said in his interview with Jimmy Young on pro-cannabis media. Fox emphasizes how DC residents and businesses are uniquely vulnerable because Congress can override local cannabis laws.
But I know that a lot of people in the cannabis space were freaking out and thinking that this is a sign of things to come. I don't think that that's necessarily going to be the case. You know, we saw that even back as far as 2018, when Jeff Sessions, who was acting attorney general at the time, rescinded the Cole memo, that federal prosecutors and USAs continued to take a hands-off approach and not mess with anybody that was in compliance with state law, because they realized that it's a tremendous waste of resources. And they'd been operating under those auspices for a number of years. So they didn't actually change their behavior because Jeff Sessions decided to write a memo rescinding that official guidance. That being said, in the absence of federal budget restrictions preventing DOJ from actually going after people that are in compliance with state laws, all it takes is a rogue prosecutor or a particularly bad attorney general to turn around more than a decade of jurisprudence on this issue. So, I think that while I'm not incredibly concerned about any sort of crackdowns, I really want to have that codified in law, even though the budget language is only temporary, it only lasts for a single fiscal year. Having that that restriction on resource allocation is really, really useful in terms of giving people peace of mind, both patients and their providers.
Advocacy matters more here than almost anywhere else. Groups like NORML are pushing for federal reform, but until DC gains true statehood or Congress backs off, the risk of federal interference remains real. So if you're operating in the district, it's not just about running a business, it's about navigating a political minefield. But you're not alone. I'm here with you every single week. There's a whole community of patients, providers, and advocates fighting to protect access and autonomy, and that's worth holding the line for. Let's continue to fight the good fight. I'm Louis Joe.
That'll do it for the A Block, our first section of this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast news. We've got more state reports for you. Next, of course, is our international reports from Canada and from over the pond, as they say, in England. Cannabis Coast to Coast news continues after this.
Accounting Buds has grown into Buds Group, the same award-winning quality, now with more service offerings. Buds Group, your best buds in the biz.
Looking for PR that over-delivers on expectations? At Maverick Public Relations, they pair big agency experience with personalized attention. From launching award-winning brands to securing top-tier media hits, their data-driven communications team helps visionary leaders and entrepreneurs rise above the media noise. Maverick PR is responsive, collaborative, and relentless about results and ROI. Visit themaverickpr.com and make headlines together.